He had always been a man who valued his peace and quiet. Living in a cozy suburban neighborhood, he enjoyed simple things: a morning coffee on the porch, the sound of birds outside his window, and evenings spent tinkering in his garage. His house was his little sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after a long week at work and feel in control of his own space. He took pride in keeping his yard neat, his driveway clear, and his garage organized. It was more than just a house. It was a reflection of who he was: calm, careful, and respectful of rules. But lately his tranquility had been interrupted by a neighbor. She was a woman who seemed to believe that the world revolved around her. She drove a sleek, expensive BMW, and to her it seemed normal rules did not apply. She parked wherever she liked, often blocking driveways, stepping on flower beds, or leaving her car in places that clearly were not hers. It had started subtly, with her car parked partially on the edge of his lawn, then a little closer each time. He didn't confront her at first. He hoped she would notice and correct herself, that perhaps she simply didn't realize the inconvenience she was causing. Then one day, things escalated. He had been preparing for a short vacation, just a few days to escape the routine and recharge. He double-checked his travel plans, packed his bag, and made sure everything around the house was in order. The garage, as always, was clean and organized, ready for a week of quiet emptiness. That's when he saw it, her BMW parked inside his garage. At first, he couldn't believe his eyes. The shiny black car was sitting there as if it belonged, right between his tools and his workbench. He stared at it, completely frozen, trying to process what had happened. He remembered clearly locking the garage the night before and making sure the door was closed. How had she even gotten in? And more importantly, why would she think this was acceptable? He approached the car slowly, trying to stay calm. Touching the hood, he looked around, half expecting her to appear with a cheeky smile as if it were some sort of joke. But the driveway was empty. The street was quiet. It became painfully clear she had left it there on purpose. His heart raced, a mix of anger and disbelief washing over him. It wasn't just a matter of space. It was a matter of respect. His property had been violated. He thought back to the countless times he had tried to be patient. There had been moments when she blocked his driveway and he would wait, hoping she'd notice and move her car. He had knocked on her door politely, asking her not to park where it caused problems. Each time she had shrugged, smirked, or given a vague excuse. Her behavior wasn't just inconsiderate, it was deliberate. She clearly thought she could do whatever she wanted, and now leaving her BMW inside his garage was the final straw. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising anger. It was tempting to just call the police or have the car towed, but he wanted something more personal. He wanted her to understand, really understand, that there were boundaries that could not be crossed. But he also knew he had to think carefully. This wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching a lesson without creating a legal or financial mess. He stepped back and started to plan. First, he examined the car, making sure not to touch it in any way that could be considered damaging. He took notes mentally, where it was parked, how it was positioned, and how it might be moved. He thought about all the ways she had taken advantage of his patience in the past and what he could do to ensure this would be the last time she overstepped. He smiled a little to himself. This would be clever, harmless, but effective. As he planned, his mind drifted to his neighbors. Most of them were kind and polite, always willing to lend a hand or share a friendly word. But a few had noticed the tension between him and the BMW driving woman. Some had even whispered about her sense of entitlement, how she seemed to ignore social norms and rules. He thought about their eyes, the quiet nods of agreement he would get when they saw her car parked in the wrong place. He wasn't alone in noticing her behavior, and that gave him a strange comfort. The man also reflected on his own values. He wasn't someone who sought conflict. He believed in fairness and respect and doing the right thing quietly. But he also believed in standing up for himself. Letting her get away with this would only encourage more of the same. He wanted her to feel a little frustration, a little surprise, enough to make her reconsider her actions in the future. Not humiliation, not anger, but a reminder that his space was his space and rules applied to everyone. He spent the next hour organizing his garage in a different way, moving things subtly so that the car's presence would be even more noticeable. Every step of the process was careful, deliberate, thoughtful. He didn't want to damage anything. He didn't want to create real conflict. He wanted her to realize naturally that she had crossed a line. As he worked, he imagined her reaction when she returned. Would she be annoyed, confused, maybe a little embarrassed? He chuckled quietly at the thought. The mix of anticipation and amusement was oddly satisfying. He wasn't a mean-spirited person, but after all the times he had been patient, he felt entitled to this small moment of cleverness. By the time evening came, he had a plan in place. The car was still there, untouched, but everything around it was positioned just so. He knew that when she came back, she would encounter an obstacle that wasn't dangerous or illegal, but would definitely make her pause. He also made sure to document everything, taking mental notes and a few discreet photos just in case anyone tried to deny what had happened later. Finally, he packed the last of his things for the vacation. He locked the doors, turned off the lights, and took one last look at the garage. The BMW gleamed under the lights, perfectly still, perfectly in place. He couldn't help but feel a little proud. Not of the car itself, but of the quiet strategy he had devised to handle a difficult situation without escalating it. He left that night feeling a strange mix of excitement and relief. Excitement because he knew something interesting would happen when she returned, and relief because for the first time, he felt like he had taken control of the situation without losing his calm. On the drive to the airport, he couldn't help but smile at the thought that his little vacation would be accompanied by an unexpected twist for his neighbor. During the flight and the first day of his vacation, he tried to focus on relaxing. He visited the beach, walked through quiet streets, and enjoyed the sunshine, but his mind often wandered back to the garage. He wondered if she had tried to move the car yet. He imagined the frustration building as she realized it wasn't going anywhere. It was almost funny, thinking about how seriously she took her BMW and how shocked she might be by the simple measures he had put in place. He also thought about the lessons involved. It wasn't just about parking or garages. It was about respect, about boundaries, about treating other people the way you want to be treated. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that this little episode could serve as a reminder for her, and maybe even others, that entitlement has limits. Sometimes the smallest actions speak the loudest, and he hoped this would be one of those moments. As he settled into the evening routine of his vacation, he reflected on his own feelings. He didn't hate his neighbor, and he wasn't angry in a destructive way. He was more amused than anything, curious to see how things would unfold. He realized that he had learned something too, that standing up for oneself doesn't require aggression or shouting. It requires thought, creativity, and a little bit of patience. He smiled, feeling satisfied that he had handled a difficult situation in a way that was clever, calm, and humane. That night, before going to sleep in his hotel room, he thought once more about the BMW in his garage. It was more than a car now. It was a symbol of boundaries, respect, and quiet determination. He imagined the next few days how the story would unfold, and he felt ready for whatever came next. He knew that when he returned, things would be different. Maybe the neighbor would apologize, maybe she would simply retreat, but either way, the balance had shifted. And in that moment, lying in the soft hotel bed, he felt a sense of peace. Not the same peace as before because the situation had been unusual, but a deeper satisfaction. He had taken control, protected his space, and done so in a way that reflected who he was. For the first time in weeks, he felt confident that he had handled a neighbor problem the way it deserved to be handled, with thought, with humor, and without causing harm. The story of the trapped BMW was only beginning, and he was eager to see how it would continue. One thing was certain: his garage, his rules, and his boundaries were no longer open to casual disregard. And that, he thought, was a lesson worth learning. He returned from vacation 2 days later, feeling refreshed, calm, and ready to face whatever awaited him at home. The trip had been a perfect escape: sunshine, quiet walks, and long afternoons without any stress. Yet even as he drove down the familiar streets toward his neighborhood, a part of his mind remained focused on the BMW. He had spent weeks planning how to handle it, imagining how she would react, and now it was time to put that plan into motion. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw the garage door exactly where he had left it. Nothing seemed out of place from the outside. The street was quiet and neighbors waved as they passed, but he hardly noticed them. He felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension, knowing that in a few moments he would see the result of his careful planning. He stepped out of the car and unlocked the garage. The smell of clean concrete and his neatly stored tools greeted him. Then his eyes fell on the BMW, parked exactly as it had been when he left. But now the difference was subtle yet important. The careful arrangement he had planned was in place. He had spent days thinking through every detail to ensure the car could not leave without her noticing the small obstacle. He had chosen a method that was clever but harmless. Nothing was damaged, nothing illegal. He had simply moved his own belongings around in a way that created a gentle barrier. When she returned and tried to move the car, she would find it stuck in an unexpected position. It wasn't just about preventing her from taking the car. It was about making her realize the consequences of ignoring other people's space. He smiled quietly to himself, satisfied with the harmless creativity of his plan. After making sure everything was in order, he decided to leave the garage and act as if nothing had changed. He wanted her to discover the situation on her own, to experience the slight confusion and surprise that he had imagined so vividly during his vacation. He made a mental note to be calm when she reacted, no matter how frustrated she might become. He knew that staying collected was essential to keeping the situation under control. Over the next day, he noticed her walking by, clearly on her way back from somewhere. She had the confident air of someone who believed the world belonged to them, walking with the certainty that she could take whatever she wanted without consequence. Yet, even before she reached the driveway, he could see her hesitating. Her eyes flicked toward the garage, and for a moment, he caught the tiniest hint of uncertainty. She opened the garage door, fully expecting to retrieve her BMW. But as soon as she saw the careful placement of items, she froze. She tilted her head, trying to figure out why she couldn't simply drive away. The car was there, intact, shining in the sunlight, but it was subtly trapped. Nothing harsh, nothing harmful, just enough to make her pause and think. He watched from inside the house, keeping a calm distance, curious about her reaction. At first she seemed confused. She circled the car, peering inside, muttering to herself. Then she tried to reverse the car, only to realize she couldn't move it far enough to get out. Frustration began to creep into her movements. Small gestures of annoyance, tapping the steering wheel, and checking doors repeatedly. It was almost entertaining. But he reminded himself not to get carried away. This wasn't about amusement, it was about respect. He had given her a chance to recognize her mistakes without confrontation, and now she was encountering a gentle reminder of why boundaries existed. The car, the garage, and the careful placement of objects created a clear message without a single word being spoken. As the hours passed, he observed from a discreet distance. She tried to call someone, presumably for help. He imagined her recounting the story in frustration, explaining that the car was trapped in his garage, and realizing slowly that her entitlement had limits. It was a lesson in patience and observation, one that he had carefully crafted so that she could feel the impact without any real harm being done. Neighbors began to notice too, though no one interfered directly. People passing by might have seen her pacing, muttering under her breath or checking her phone repeatedly. Their quiet awareness added to the effect, a subtle acknowledgement that her actions had not gone unnoticed. For him, it was satisfying to see that the neighborhood would quietly witness a situation where respect for others' property was enforced in a clever way. Throughout the day, he kept himself busy with his usual chores as if nothing unusual were happening. He mowed the lawn, fixed a small leak in the kitchen sink, and watered the garden. This gave him the chance to stay calm while observing, and also to reinforce that he was not angry in a destructive sense. His actions were about boundaries, not punishment. He thought back to his previous interactions with her. There had been small tensions, blocked driveways, loud arguments over trivial things, and moments when she treated his property as if it were an extension of her own privileges. Each incident had been irritating, but he had tried to ignore or politely correct her. Nothing worked. Now, he realized, subtle ingenuity could succeed where direct confrontation had failed. That evening, she finally called someone else for advice, and he could see her frustration growing. Her confidence had been shaken, and for the first time, she had to pause and consider that perhaps she had misjudged the situation. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the lesson was sinking in. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about planting a seed of awareness that actions have consequences. He reflected on how often people ignore boundaries when they think no one is paying attention. In her case, it wasn't malice, it was entitlement and the assumption that the rules didn't apply to her. His careful planning had created a moment where she would have to acknowledge reality, a moment where she couldn't simply bulldoze through. It was subtle, but it was effective. As the day turned into night, she finally gave up for the moment, leaving the garage in a state of frustration. He knew she would return later, but he had given her enough time to reflect. Sometimes the pause was more important than immediate action. It allowed her to process, to see the situation clearly, and perhaps to learn something about patience and respect. He spent the night thinking about what had happened, not in a way that glorified his cleverness, but in a way that helped him understand human behavior. People often push limits, assuming that boundaries are flexible. It was not about confrontation, but about creating a situation that encouraged self-awareness. By staying calm and thoughtful, he had created a natural consequence for her actions without escalating conflict. The next morning, he checked the garage again. She had returned, trying once more to move the car. This time she seemed more frustrated, more aware of the limits of her control. He watched quietly from a distance, ready to step in only if absolutely necessary. But he could see that his subtle arrangement was enough. She had to pause, consider, and find her way out carefully. It was exactly what he had planned. Throughout the day, he continued his routine, maintaining a calm presence. He watered the plants, read a book on the porch, and even chatted briefly with a neighbor who passed by. All the while, he kept an eye on the garage, making sure everything remained safe. He wanted to ensure that his lesson remained harmless, that it would create reflection rather than conflict. By the afternoon, he noticed a change in her demeanor. The confident air she had carried before was replaced with quiet caution. She moved slowly, carefully maneuvering around the subtle obstacles he had placed. He could see her thinking, calculating, trying to figure out why this simple garage had become such a challenge. It was clear she was beginning to understand, in her own way, that her previous assumptions about entitlement were no longer valid. He reflected on the power of subtlety. Sometimes the most effective lessons are not loud or aggressive, but quiet, clever and non-threatening. People resist obvious confrontation, but a gentle nudge, a small obstacle, or a moment of confusion can encourage reflection and change. He felt satisfied that his approach was working exactly as he had hoped. By the evening, she had managed to get the car out, but slowly and carefully, realizing she could no longer treat his property as an extension of her own convenience. The lesson had been delivered without damage, without argument, and without escalation. He watched from inside, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about winning or punishing. It was about creating awareness and enforcing boundaries in a clever, human way. He went to bed that night feeling calm and reflective. The BMW was gone, temporarily or permanently, and the situation had unfolded exactly as he had hoped. He understood that people often need small, safe reminders to respect others. He had delivered that reminder, subtly and cleverly, without malice or aggression. As he drifted to sleep, he thought about the next steps. The neighbor had learned something important, whether she realized it fully or not. The balance in the neighborhood had shifted slightly. He had defended his space, asserted his boundaries, and done so in a way that reflected his personality, calm, thoughtful, and humane. The BMW incident was over for now, but it had set the stage for future interactions, showing that respect and patience were not to be ignored, and so, with the quiet satisfaction of a lesson well taught, he slept peacefully, knowing that sometimes the most powerful actions are those taken with thought, care, and a gentle touch rather than anger or force. The next morning, he woke up to the usual quiet of his neighborhood. The birds were chirping, the sunlight streamed through the curtains, and for a brief moment he felt at peace again. But he knew that peace was temporary. The BMW was still parked in the garage. Well, technically it had been moved the day before, but the subtle trap he had left behind meant the car was still limited in movement. Today the situation would escalate in a way he had been anticipating. He went about his morning routine, making coffee, checking the mailbox, and watering the plants, but his attention kept drifting to the garage. It wasn't just curiosity, it was careful observation. He wanted to see how the neighbor would react, how frustrated or confused she would become when she realized she couldn't just take the car and leave. From the way she had behaved the previous day, he could tell she was already shaken. The arrogance she usually carried seemed to have dulled. replaced with a hint of uncertainty. By mid-morning, he noticed her walking along the sidewalk, keys in hand, clearly intent on going to the garage. He stepped back, making sure not to be obvious, and watched from the window. She had that determined look, the one people get when they believe they can fix a problem with sheer force or persistence. But the difference today was that she didn't know what she was walking into. When she opened the garage, her eyes widened immediately. The BMW was still there, parked precisely where he had left it, surrounded by carefully positioned obstacles that prevented easy movement. Her face went from surprise to irritation, and then to genuine confusion. She stepped closer to inspect the situation, tapping the hood lightly and muttering under her breath. For a moment, he almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he reminded himself why he had done this. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about boundaries. Every polite request she had ignored, every driveway she had blocked, every assumption that his space was hers, all of that led to this moment. He felt calm, almost proud, because he had handled it without aggression, without yelling, without damage. He had used patience and planning to create consequences for her actions. She tried to reverse the car slowly, carefully nudging it back and forth. Her frustration was growing, visible in the tense lines of her shoulders and the way her eyes darted around the garage. She glanced at him once, as if expecting him to intervene or apologize, but he remained inside, watching quietly. This was the lesson he had hoped for. Let her face the situation, figure it out, and reflect on her actions. She pulled out her phone and started making calls. He couldn't hear the conversation, but judging by the hand gestures and the rolling eyes, it wasn't pleasant. Perhaps she was explaining the trapped car to a friend or neighbor, seeking advice or sympathy. He imagined her describing the scene with exaggeration, talking about how impossible it was to move the car and how unfair it all seemed. A small smile tugged at his lips. Her sense of entitlement had finally collided with reality. He took a moment to reflect on what was happening. People often assume that the world bends to their convenience, that others will adapt or move aside. She had acted under that assumption for months, even years, and now it was clear she had reached the edge of that illusion. Boundaries are not just physical, they are emotional and social. By carefully arranging the space in his garage, he had created a boundary she could not ignore. As she continued to examine the situation, he noticed a shift. Her frustration was mixing with a little uncertainty, a new awareness that she could not simply take what she wanted without consequence. She circled the car, checking from every angle, realizing that her usual confidence was useless here. She could no longer assume that the driveway or garage was hers to control. Meanwhile, he stayed calm, maintaining a neutral presence inside his home. He knew that any sudden move on his part could escalate the situation unnecessarily. The goal was reflection, not confrontation. He had learned over time that people respond differently to different types of pressure. Direct confrontation often leads to denial or argument. A clever, harmless obstacle, on the other hand, forces them to pause and reconsider. Hours passed, and she continued to struggle. Her patience was thinning, and he noticed the subtle changes in her behavior. She muttered more frequently, her movements were less confident, and her usually commanding demeanor was now replaced with hesitation. Neighbors passing by might have noticed the scene, but no one interfered. There was something almost poetic about the quiet observation of a person learning that their usual methods of control did not always work. During a break in her attempts, she leaned against the wall and sighed, running her fingers through her hair. He imagined her replaying past incidents in her mind, the times she had parked without permission, ignored polite requests, or acted as if rules did not apply to her. This moment of pause was exactly what he had intended. She wasn't angry at him personally. She was processing the consequences of her own actions. He stepped outside briefly to water the plants in front of the house, keeping an eye on her without being intrusive. She noticed him, and for the first time there was a flicker of recognition that he was not an obstacle to fight, but a person whose space deserved respect. She didn't approach him, didn't argue, but the look in her eyes told him that the lesson was starting to sink in. The day wore on, and she tried a few more strategies to move the car. She shifted objects, tried nudging the BMW from different angles, and even stepped back to consider calling someone else for help. Each attempt met with subtle resistance, and each failure chipped away at her confidence. He watched calmly, aware that this was not just a test of her patience, but a test of his own composure as well. By late afternoon, he noticed her slowing down, her movements becoming less frantic. She was thinking, calculating, and perhaps realizing for the first time that she had been taking advantage of him for too long. His method had worked exactly as planned. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't damaged property, and he hadn't caused a scene. Yet the impact was undeniable. She was learning, slowly but surely, that boundaries are not suggestions, they are rules. He returned inside, making tea and glancing occasionally toward the garage. He reflected on how often people fail to understand the consequences of their actions until they are faced with them directly. For her, the consequences were minor, harmless, yet meaningful. She couldn't just drive away and ignore what she had done. She had to confront it, process it, and adapt. Neighbors began to trickle back into view, going about their evening routines. Some glanced toward the garage, curious about the unusual situation. Others gave knowing looks, subtle acknowledgments of the tension in the air. He didn't intervene or draw attention. He simply observed, allowing the natural social context to reinforce the lesson he was teaching. As evening fell, she finally stopped her attempts for a moment. Sweat on her brow, fingers tense from trying to maneuver the car. She stepped back and looked around the garage with a mix of exasperation and realization. She wasn't angry at him. She was processing the reality of her own behavior. And he, standing inside, maintained calm, allowing her to reach her own conclusions without interference. He thought about how many times people in life assume the rules do not apply to them. It wasn't always malicious. Often it was carelessness, arrogance, or simple habit. But habits can be changed and lessons can be taught. Today, through a careful, harmless arrangement, he had managed to create a moment of awareness that might stick for a long time. She tried again briefly, then gave up and sat on the small step near the garage door, muttering quietly to herself. He knew she was thinking, replaying her assumptions, questioning her actions, and coming face to face with a truth she had ignored for far too long. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but it was effective. Sometimes the smallest obstacles are the most powerful teachers. Night approached and he noticed her leaving the area, presumably to gather herself before trying again tomorrow. He didn't feel triumphant or vengeful. He felt satisfied that a lesson had been delivered in a safe, human way. The BMW remained where it was, and the garage, his carefully controlled space, had reminded her that boundaries exist for a reason. Sitting down with a cup of tea, he reflected on what had unfolded. The day had been intense, not because of conflict, but because of patience and observation. He had witnessed the transformation of a person's confidence into humility, frustration into reflection, and entitlement into understanding. It was subtle, almost invisible to the outside world, but deeply meaningful for both of them. He understood that the situation wasn't over. She would return, try again, and perhaps take different approaches. But he had planted the seed of awareness, and that was enough for now. People often resist lessons, but given time and gentle boundaries, they adapt. He had created a situation that encouraged that adaptation without harm, aggression, or anger. As he prepared for bed that night, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Not pride in cleverness or trickery, but satisfaction in having handled a difficult situation thoughtfully and humanely. He realized that the BMW incident, while small in the grand scheme of life, had taught him something too, that patience, careful planning, and calm observation are sometimes more powerful than confrontation or aggression. He looked out the window one last time before turning off the lights. The garage stood. The next morning began with a tense energy in the neighborhood, though most people would not have noticed it. The sun rose over quiet streets, children heading off to school, neighbors walking their dogs, all normal scenes. But inside the garage, the BMW sat as it had before, a silent reminder of yesterday's lessons. The woman had returned again, her movements sharper, her frustration more visible. He watched from inside, curious to see how she would handle today. She opened the garage door slowly, almost cautiously. Her eyes scanned the space, taking in the carefully positioned obstacles that prevented her from simply driving away. She paused for a long moment. The anger and disbelief in her expression mixed with the first real hint of respect for the boundaries he had established. She stepped closer to the car, running a hand along the side, muttering words that he couldn't hear but could easily imagine. Complaints, disbelief, frustration. and perhaps even a touch of self-recrimination. He stayed back, keeping his distance. He knew that any sudden movement or confrontation from him could escalate the situation unnecessarily. He wanted her to reach her own conclusions. Over the past couple of days, he had observed her reactions and realized that she needed time to process the subtle, yet undeniable message. Today, however, things felt different. Her energy was more intense, her determination sharper. She wasn't just confused anymore, she was actively strategizing how to regain control. She circled the BMW carefully, checking each angle. She shifted a few of the items around, testing to see if she could squeeze the car past the barriers he had put in place. Her movements were precise but tense, and it was clear that the effort was exhausting her patience. Sweat glistened on her forehead as she tried again and again, realizing with each attempt that the car wasn't going to move easily. He watched quietly, silently proud of the calm, harmless effectiveness of his plan. Eventually, she took a step back, her hands on her hips, breathing heavily. She ran a hand through her hair, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. For a brief moment, he saw something he hadn't expected before, a flicker of realization in her eyes. She began to understand that she had pushed boundaries too far, and that her usual approach of ignoring rules and taking whatever she wanted no longer worked. But she wasn't ready to admit defeat. Determined, she walked around the garage again, inspecting every possible way out. She tried opening doors, looking for gaps, and even moving more objects in the hope of freeing the car. Each time she met with resistance, and each failure chipped away at her confidence. His careful planning had ensured that she would not be able to simply drive away, but he had also made certain that nothing could be damaged and no one could be hurt. He thought about how often life teaches lessons in subtle ways. People rarely respond to gentle words alone. Sometimes they need to face the consequences of their own choices directly. Over the years, he had learned that patience, creativity, and a little harmless cleverness often achieve more than anger or force. Today was proof of that. He could see the lesson sinking in, slowly but steadily. Neighbors began to notice the tension as she continued to work on freeing the BMW. Some glanced curiously from a distance, while others whispered quietly among themselves. He didn't intervene, didn't draw attention, allowing the scene to unfold naturally. Social context can be powerful, he realized. People learn not only from their own mistakes, but also from seeing others notice and react to their behavior. The subtle acknowledgement of the neighborhood added weight to the lesson he was teaching. She paused again, this time letting out a long sigh. Frustration mixed with disbelief, and he could see the internal struggle as she wrestled with her pride and her desire to take control. For a moment, he wondered if she would finally confront him directly, demanding answers or explanations. He felt ready, knowing that he would remain calm and collected. The key was to maintain composure, to explain clearly without anger, and to reinforce the lesson gently but firmly. Eventually, she did come forward, stepping closer to the door of the garage and calling out to him. Her voice carried a mix of annoyance and disbelief. He came out slowly, keeping his hands visible and his tone neutral. She launched into a rapid explanation, a flurry of words and complaints, but he listened calmly, letting her speak without interruption. The act of listening itself seemed to unsettle her, as if she expected him to argue or retaliate. Once she paused to take a breath, he spoke, calmly and clearly. He explained that the BMW was parked in his garage without permission, that repeated requests for boundaries had been ignored, and that his careful arrangement of objects was meant to illustrate that respect for others' property is not optional. He spoke without anger, without sarcasm, but with firm conviction. His words were measured, thoughtful, and honest. Her reaction was a mixture of emotions. She looked surprised at his calm demeanor, frustrated at her own predicament, and slowly, grudgingly, she began to understand the point he was making. The BMW had been a symbol of her disregard for boundaries, and now it had become a tangible lesson. She could no longer treat his space as her own, and he had demonstrated that with patience and clever planning rather than confrontation or hostility. He could see the wheels turning in her mind. Pride wrestled with acknowledgement, annoyance with understanding. It was clear she was beginning to internalize the lesson, that rules exist for a reason, that entitlement has limits, and that respecting others is not optional. He maintained his calm presence, knowing that the more he reacted, the less effective the lesson would be. His goal was understanding, not conflict. Hours passed, and she continued to process the situation. He didn't leave her alone, but he remained nearby, ready to clarify if needed, to answer questions if asked, but never to escalate. The calm human approach contrasted sharply with her previous assumptions that every challenge could be met with force or entitlement. Slowly, she realized that her actions had consequences even when no one was yelling or punishing her. The day wore on, and her frustration began to soften. She moved more carefully now, thinking through each step rather than acting impulsively. He could see the change in her approach, a subtle shift from arrogance to caution, from assumption to awareness. It was exactly what he had hoped for. She was learning, not through confrontation but through experience and reflection. He took a moment to step back, observing the scene quietly. It struck him how powerful subtlety can be. People often resist lessons delivered with anger, but when consequences are clear, harmless, and thoughtfully arranged, understanding can grow naturally. Today he had demonstrated that patience, planning, and calm observation can teach important lessons without conflict. By late afternoon, she had finally paused, leaning against the wall and taking a long breath. Her expression was no longer one of pure frustration. It was a mixture of thoughtfulness and grudging respect. For the first time, he saw that she understood that his space was not hers to control, and that her previous assumptions about entitlement had been mistaken. He approached her gently, maintaining a neutral and calm tone. He emphasized that this was not about winning or punishment, but about mutual respect and understanding. The conversation was brief but impactful. She listened, nodded occasionally, and slowly began to acknowledge that her previous behavior had been inconsiderate. The BMW was still parked, a visual reminder of the lesson she had just learned. As the sun began to set, the tension in the garage finally started to ease. She moved the car slowly, carefully, respecting the boundaries he had established. Each movement was deliberate, each action considered. It was clear that she had learned something important, not just about parking or property, but about patience, respect, and the consequences of taking liberties with others' space. Neighbors walking by noticed the change as well. The air of confrontation had softened, replaced by quiet understanding. Some exchanged nods or smiles, recognizing that a difficult situation had been handled without drama or aggression. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the lesson had been delivered thoughtfully, humanely, and effectively. By evening, the BMW was finally in a position where it could leave safely, but the lesson remained. She had internalized the experience, understanding the limits of her behavior and the importance of boundaries. He reflected on the entire day, grateful that patience, creativity, and calm had worked better than any argument or confrontation ever could. He went inside for the night, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. Not pride in cleverness, but satisfaction in having handled a difficult situation in a way that reinforced respect, taught a lesson, and avoided conflict. The BMW incident, once a source of stress and frustration, had become a story of human understanding, reflection, and growth. As he lay down to sleep, he realized that sometimes the most powerful lessons are not loud or aggressive, but subtle, patient, and thoughtful. Today had been a clear demonstration of that principle. The BMW was no longer just a car. It was a symbol of boundaries, respect, and the effectiveness of calm, intelligent action. And in the quiet of the night, he felt at peace, knowing that he had handled a difficult neighbor situation the way it deserved, carefully, cleverly, and humanely, leaving behind a lesson that would not be forgotten.